Okay, sustainability. So, do we live in a sustainable society? First point I want to pick up on here then is GDP, so gross domestic product. There was actually an article at the beginning of this week, former head of the civil service in the UK calling for well-being to be to replace GDP as the measure of progress. Now, GDP is essentially really how much stuff is made within a country, and that's not necessarily the be-all and end-all in terms of what we might consider to be progress or well-being of a society. It's arguable that growth, typically referred to and measured in units of GDP, has become almost like an ideology that we are fixated on. So if that is essentially what we are continually solving for in our economy, I'd argue that it's going to be challenging to actually build a better one. So, slightly more complicated one here, fractional reserve banking. So this essentially enables banks, so we'll just go through this diagram. So if somebody puts money into a bank, they are then able to lend out typically 10 times more than the amount that they have as a reserve, and then to charge interest on that additional loan. So if you or I started to print our own money at home, we'd probably be arrested pretty quickly. But it turns out that if you're a private bank, you can. And you can also charge interest on it. So this is just an example here. I don't know how clear it might be on the screen. But we have somebody come along, they put $1,000 into a bank. So 100 gets used as a reserve, 900 is loaned out. That would then essentially, create more money in the system. We then end up in a repeat of that. So we have an exponentially increasing supply of money, but also, if it is being loaned out, an exponentially increasing supply of debt in the system, which again is a systemic global challenge in my view. So, looking at increasing debt, there's much talk about how, for example, in the UK we have a never-ending increase in the deficit, so government spending. You might see in America every now and again it reaches a ceiling and Congress freezes up and they have to approve going over the limit even more. Now, given that we have a system that is exponentially increasing the amount of debt, it's not particularly surprising that government debt is exponentially increasing, or going up at least over time. Now, the challenge with that, and much of Western Europe has just experienced austerity, really in the name of trying to service this debt, which has led to all kinds of cuts in social care and welfare. But it's almost an ideological choice that we actually have a system that is fueling debt, rather than necessarily something that has to be there. So this is just a look at government debt from around the world as a percentage of GDP. And what's particularly interesting is that we can see that it spiked around about the time of World War I, and then again around the time of World War II, which makes sense. Governments were investing large amounts of money in fighting wars. But we actually also used to have a gold standard, whereby money was actually backed by a precious metal. And what we can see is that once the gold standard ended, essentially there wasn't essentially any control on the amount of money in the system. That debt increased quite considerably. So maybe just to finish the point there, it's really that I don't think you can have a system where the amount of debt in the system is increasing forever, and for that to be sustainable, I think is the ultimate point here. You need to somehow transition away from that. Now, this is looking at, it's a little bit of a perhaps confusing chart, but we've got different, the ore grades of a series of different elements up there. So we've got copper, gold, lead, zinc, uranium, nickel, diamonds. And what we essentially see is that over this last 160 odd years, the ore grades have been declining for just about every one of these elements, and that the general trend is certainly going down. And what this is typically representative of is the idea that we find the low-hanging fruit pretty quickly, and then it becomes more and more difficult and more expensive to extract the various different, whether it be oil and gas or any other metal, and that costs more and more money, because it's harder to find. So this is just a sort of general trend that we typically find over time, where you almost reach a peak, the idea of almost like peak minerals, where to begin with, it's relatively cheap, it's easy to find, and then at a certain point in time, that starts to decline, and also the environmental or social, economical, environmental costs will be going up as well. Now, arguably, one of the reasons that we are starting to see, or we have seen, very low growth measured in GDP over the last 10, 20 years or so, is that essentially this chart has got to the point where for various different minerals that we are exploiting from the earth, we've actually reached the point where it's becoming increasingly difficult to extract value from them. There's actually a concept known as, so we have in the investment world, ROI, or return on investment. So there's return on energy investment. And what that is essentially saying is that if you have to expend, let's say, 100 units of energy to get oil out of the ground, and then when you burn that, you get 150 units, okay, well, that makes sense, you're plus 50. But as that margin starts to get smaller and tighter, actually it's debatable how much sense it actually makes to be extracting those kinds of commodities. One example again there would be extracting oil or gas from the Arctic, where the amount of money it's costing and the amount of energy it's taking to actually get the stuff out of the ground, and also, so if we look at, for example, tar sands, that's some of the what's the word? I guess the least efficient in terms of converting that actually to energy. So yeah, you really do have to question whether or not some of this extraction makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some of these more environmental issues. So this is the 9 planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I should say this chart is actually from 2015, and I have a sneaky feeling that if they went back over it, it would be worse if we looked at it today. But just to give you a bit of a sense, what they've tried to do is map these different planetary boundaries that they essentially believe need to be in some sort of balance in order for things to be, let's say, safe. That's what the word they've used. And so we can see with various different elements here that we are into the orange or the red zone. Several are not quantified, and several are in the zone of uncertainty, where that's the yellow, where they're saying that they are not entirely sure. So it could be bad, but they don't quite have enough data yet. And so I guess what that really is suggesting is that if we're sort of looking at the dashboard, the control panel of planet Earth, there are quite a few buttons that are flashing red right now. So you might have seen the news recently, last 6 months or so, but it seems that humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since the 70s. And another slightly worrying fact is that we've seen a massive plunge in insect numbers as well. Insects are pollinators, they're often part of the food chain for other animals. I mean, this is deeply worrying. No other way to put it, really. And then looking at soil, so there's also been various different bits of research that have come out that are suggesting that the quality of the soil is being degraded to the point where the number of harvests we might actually have, I'm sure that varies quite a lot from different places, but in some places saying sort of 30 to 40 years, talking about the UK. So again, clearly we're not doing something right in terms of our farming techniques, many of which are monoculture, an awful lot of pesticides being used. I think if some of our ancestors knew what we were doing now, they'd sort of say, you've gone mad. There's lots of techniques there that are used, which are much more about preserving the land and working with it and making sure that it's preserved for future generations. Okay, so this is looking then at some of the environmental, climate-related disasters, and I think we probably agree that we can see a pretty clear increasing trend over time. So we've got the brown, which is the bottom one, that's geophysical disasters. The blue, sort of dark blue, is climate-related, and then the economic damage. And I think the economic damage is also particularly interesting when you look at major climatic events. We have much of the insurance industry that is suggesting that a 3-degree plus world would be uninsurable. There's quite considerable issues every time you have a major disaster. So this is just a little bit of, recent news. So this was Australia back in January. They actually had to introduce a new colour for their weather map. That's the dark purple in the middle. And essentially what often happens is when there's extreme weather is that the oxygen changes in rivers, and we see die-offs with, for example here, fish. And at the same time that was happening, in America, we had a pretty massive deep freeze, which was actually due to the polar vortex shifting. So sort of one half of the planet burning,